"Security, remove this individual immediately." Charles Blackstone's voice cut through Lincoln Plaza as he gestured dismissively toward the homeless veteran, clutching a cardboard sign reading, "Can I play it for food?" Blackstone chuckled at the absurd request, while the $2.8 million Steinway stood between them like a monument separating their worlds. With the charity gala starting in 90 minutes, the last thing he needed was this eyesore disrupting his veterans' fundraiser. "I just need 30 seconds, James Mitchell said quietly, his calloused fingers moving with impossible precision above the keys. Blackstone turned away, unaware that the man before him held the power to transform skepticism into awe with just 30 seconds. What do you think happens when one moment changes everything? The October wind carried the scent of roasted coffee and expensive perfume through Lincoln Plaza, but James Mitchell smelled neither. 3 years of living in his rusted Ford van had dulled most of his senses, except for the one that mattered most, his perfect pitch. As the morning sun cast long shadows across the plaza's marble tiles, he could hear the piano tuner working on the Steinway, adjusting the G-sharp in the 4th octave. The sound made his fingers twitch involuntarily, muscle memory awakening after 8 years of deliberate silence. His cardboard sign rested against his knee, the marker ink slightly smudged from last night's rain. "Can I play it for food?" The words felt both desperate and defiant, a question that carried the weight of everything he'd lost and everything he hoped to reclaim. The charity event was still 2 hours away, but the setup crew had been working since dawn. Lincoln Plaza buzzed with the controlled chaos of preparation florists arranging white orchids, caterers positioning silver serving trays, and security guards establishing their perimeter. James had chosen his spot carefully, close enough to see the piano, but far enough to avoid immediate ejection. The Steinway Model D dominated the center of the plaza like a black jewel, its polished surface reflecting the morning light. He knew this piano intimately, though no one here would believe that. Serial number 376492, crafted in 1982, originally owned by Evelyn Thornton, before her estate donated it to charity auctions. He'd spent countless hours practicing on this very instrument during his 2 years as Evelyn's student, back when his biggest worry was perfecting Rachmaninoff's 3rd concerto. "Excuse me, sir." The voice belonged to Rebecca Walsh, a sharp-featured woman in her late 20s, whose MBA credentials from Wharton practically radiated from her perfectly pressed blazer. She approached with the confident stride of someone accustomed to solving problems quickly and efficiently. Her eyes swept over James with clinical assessment. The worn combat boots, the army surplus jacket with its faded patches, the 3-day stubble that spoke of nights spent in parking lots rather than hotel rooms. "I'm afraid this is private property. The plaza is closed for our event preparation." Her tone was professional but firm, the kind of voice that brooked no argument. She gestured toward the security guards stationed near the fountain, their presence a subtle reminder of consequences. James looked up from his sitting position on the cold concrete, noting how Rebecca's gaze carefully avoided direct eye contact. "I understand, ma'am. I was hoping I might be able to play something before the guests arrive, just for a few minutes." His voice carried the rough edges of too many sleepless nights, but underneath lay the careful diction of someone who'd once moved in different circles. He nodded toward the piano, where the tuner was now adjusting the sustain pedal mechanism. "That's a beautiful instrument. Steinway Model D, if I'm not mistaken. They don't make them quite like that anymore." The observation slipped out naturally, a glimpse of knowledge that didn't quite fit with his current appearance. Rebecca's expression shifted slightly, confusion flickering across her features before professional courtesy reasserted itself. "I'm sure it is, sir. But as I mentioned, this is a private event. The Music for Hope Gala is raising funds for veterans' mental health services and we simply cannot have—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "We cannot have unauthorized individuals near our equipment. I'm certain you understand." The implication hung in the air between them that his presence would somehow contaminate the pristine environment they'd so carefully constructed. Her phone buzzed with incoming text messages, undoubtedly coordination details from other staff members managing the elaborate logistics. The irony wasn't lost on James that a fundraiser for veterans' mental health was actively excluding the very demographic it claimed to serve. He'd seen this pattern before, in board meetings and charity galas during his previous life, when he'd worn Armani suits instead of Army surplus. "The veteran services," he said quietly. "That's a worthy cause. I served 2 tours in Afghanistan myself." He gestured to the small American flag patch on his jacket sleeve, its colors faded, but still visible. "Just thought maybe music could be part of healing, you know? Sometimes the best medicine comes from unexpected places." His fingers unconsciously formed the opening chord of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece that had once helped him process the nightmares that still occasionally visited his sleep. A flicker of something guilt, perhaps, or genuine concern crossed Rebecca's face, but her professional demeanor quickly reasserted itself. She glanced at her smartphone, checking the time with the practiced efficiency of someone juggling multiple deadlines. "I appreciate your service, truly, but we have very strict protocols. The event begins in less than 2 hours, and our security team needs to clear the area completely." Her voice softened marginally, adding a layer of human warmth to the corporate messaging. "There's a veterans center about 6 blocks east of here. They might have resources that could help you." She turned to leave, then paused, perhaps sensing something in his quiet acceptance that didn't quite align with her expectations of how such encounters typically unfolded. James watched her retreat toward the command tent, where other event organizers huddled around clipboards and laptops, their choreographed efficiency a stark contrast to his own displacement. The security guards had noticed the interaction and were now positioned more pointedly in his direction, their hands resting casually on their radio equipment. He could feel the invisible timer ticking. Soon they would approach with less courtesy and more authority. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the plaza's stone surfaces and casting new shadows across the Steinway's elegant curves. 2 maintenance workers wheeled a cart of additional equipment past his position, their conversation carrying fragments about sound system checks and microphone placement for the afternoon speeches. "What if I told you I've played this exact piano before?" James called out, his voice carrying just far enough to reach Rebecca as she consulted with a clipboard-wielding assistant. The words emerged with quiet confidence, not as a plea, but as a simple statement of fact. "Evelyn Thornton's piano, isn't it? I played it once." He stood slowly, brushing dust from his jeans, his posture shifting subtly from supplicant to someone who belonged in the conversation. The change was almost imperceptible, a straightening of shoulders, a slight lifting of chin, but it altered the entire dynamic of the moment. Rebecca turned back, her expression caught between amusement and irritation. "Sure you have, sir," she replied, her tone carrying the practiced skepticism of someone who'd heard countless unlikely stories from people seeking attention or access. She exchanged a meaningful glance with her assistant, a shared moment of eye-rolling that spoke volumes about their daily experiences managing events in urban environments. "I really do need you to move along now. Our security team will be conducting their final sweep in 15 minutes, and I'd prefer not to involve them in this conversation." Her words carried an implicit threat wrapped in professional courtesy, the kind of warning that suggested limited patience for continued discussion. Word traveled fast in the interconnected world of event management, and within 20 minutes, James found himself the center of unwanted attention. A small crowd had gathered at the plaza's periphery, early arriving vendors, curious passers-by, and people who'd overheard fragments of his exchange with Rebecca Walsh. Their whispered conversations created a low buzz of speculation that grew with each retelling. "Did you hear what he said about the piano?" One voice carried across the morning air. "Claims he's played it before." Another voice responded with skeptical laughter. "Yeah, right. Probably saw it in a magazine somewhere." The gathering crowd transformed what had been a simple ejection into something resembling a minor spectacle, the kind that event organizers feared most: uncontrolled variables that could spiral into public relations disasters. Frank Williams, head of security for Blackstone Foundation events, approached with the measured gait of someone accustomed to diffusing situations before they escalated. His 20-year career in private security had taught him to read people quickly, and something about the homeless veteran's posture didn't align with typical vagrant behavior. James sat with his back straight, hands resting calmly on his knees, displaying none of the agitation or defensiveness that Frank usually encountered in these situations. "Sir, I'm going to need you to gather your belongings and move along," Frank said, his voice carrying authority tempered with professional courtesy. "This is private property, and we're preparing for a major event." He gestured toward the expanding crowd with visible concern. "Your presence here is creating a disturbance that we simply cannot allow to continue." "I'm not causing any disturbance," James replied evenly, his gaze moving between Frank and the Steinway piano. "I'm sitting quietly, bothering no one." The crowd gathered because people are curious about music, about possibility. That's not something to fear. His words carried an undertone of challenge that surprised Frank, who was accustomed to quick compliance from transients when confronted with authority. James's military bearing became more apparent as he spoke: the controlled breathing, the steady eye contact, the way he held his ground without becoming aggressive. "I served my country for 4 years, Mr. Williams. I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here because that piano represents something important, something healing." The situation took an unexpected turn when Charles Blackstone himself emerged from the command tent, his expensive Italian shoes clicking against the plaza's marble surface. The billionaire philanthropist cut an imposing figure. Silver-haired, impeccably dressed, radiating the confidence that came from never having been told no about anything that mattered to him. His foundation's annual Music for Hope Gala was his pet project, a carefully orchestrated event that combined his love of classical music with his commitment to veterans' causes. The growing crowd around a homeless man represented exactly the kind of chaos that threatened the pristine image he'd spent months crafting. "What exactly is the problem here?" Blackstone demanded, his voice carrying the edge of someone unaccustomed to unexpected complications in his meticulously planned events. Frank quickly briefed his employer on the situation, while James remained seated, observing the power dynamics with the analytical eye of someone who'd once navigated similar hierarchies. Blackstone's gaze swept over him with unconcealed disdain-taking in the worn clothing, the weathered cardboard sign, the general appearance of someone who'd fallen through society's cracks. "This is exactly what I was concerned about," Blackstone said to Rebecca, who had hurried over upon seeing her boss's arrival. "We're trying to create an atmosphere of elegance and hope, not this." He gestured vaguely in James's direction, as if his presence alone might contaminate the carefully curated environment. "Our donors expect a certain standard. This gentleman's situation, while perhaps unfortunate, is simply incompatible with our objectives." The crowd had grown to nearly 50 people by now, drawn by the spectacle of wealth confronting poverty in such a public setting. Several onlookers held smartphones, capturing moments that could easily transform into viral content with the right narrative push. James watched this development with growing interest, recognizing an opportunity amid the mounting pressure. "Mr. Blackstone," he said, rising slowly to his feet, "your foundation does beautiful work for veterans. I've read about your initiatives, your commitment to mental health services." His voice carried genuine respect, devoid of sarcasm or confrontation. "But what if I told you that piano over there, the centerpiece of your elegant event, has a flaw that could embarrass your foundation in front of your donors?" The assertion landed like a physical blow among the gathered officials. Tom Collins, the piano tuner who'd been working on the instrument all morning, looked up sharply from his position near the Steinway's fallboard. He'd spent 3 hours preparing the instrument, checking every aspect of its mechanical and tonal condition. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Tom called out, his professional pride clearly stung by the implication that he'd missed something significant. His toolkit lay spread across a small table nearby electronic tuning devices, felt hammers, voicing tools that represented decades of specialized knowledge. "I've been tuning pianos for 25 years. This instrument is in perfect condition." James walked slowly toward the piano, his movements drawing the attention of everyone in the plaza. The crowd parted naturally, creating a clear path between him and the instrument that had become the center of this escalating drama. "The G sharp in the 4th octave," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "It's approximately 12 cents sharp, not enough to be obvious to casual listeners, but enough to create harmonic dissonance during complex passages. Additionally, the action on key 47 feels sluggish, probably a humidity issue affecting the hammer alignment." He stopped just outside touching distance of the piano, respecting the invisible boundary that separated him from the instrument. "I noticed it from across the plaza." Perfect pitch has its advantages. Tom Collins's face went through a rapid series of expressions: skepticism, confusion, and finally, grudging concern. He pulled out his electronic tuning device and checked the key James had mentioned, his movements now more deliberate and focused than they'd been all morning. The digital readout confirmed what James had observed. The G sharp was indeed 12 cents sharp, a discrepancy that would be almost impossible to detect from 30 feet away without exceptional musical training. "How did you—" Tom began, then stopped himself, suddenly aware that he was validating the homeless man's expertise in front of an audience that included his employer and the foundation's board members. The revelation created a moment of suspended tension in which everyone present recalibrated their assumptions about the vagrant who'd somehow diagnosed a technical problem that had escaped professional detection. Charles Blackstone's expression shifted from dismissive irritation to something resembling concern, while Rebecca Walsh found herself re-examining her initial assessment of the situation. The crowd sensed the dramatic shift, their murmured conversations growing more animated as they processed what they'd just witnessed. Frank Williams stepped closer to his employer, ready to provide guidance on how to handle this unexpected development that threatened to transform a simple removal into something far more complex and potentially embarrassing. "How did he know that?" Tom whispered to Rebecca, his voice carrying just far enough to reach the nearest onlookers. "I just discovered that tuning issue 10 minutes ago." The technical validation had shifted the entire dynamic of the confrontation, creating an unexpected pause in what had seemed like an inevitable ejection. James sensed the opening and pressed forward with quiet confidence, his years of military strategy informing his approach to this civilian battlefield. "The serial number is 376492, he said, his voice carrying across the plaza with surprising authority. "Evelyn bought it for her 50th birthday in 1982. I was her student for 2 years before I enlisted." The specificity of his knowledge cut through the skeptical murmur of the crowd like a blade, creating a moment of stillness that seemed to stretch endlessly. Rebecca Walsh felt the ground shift beneath her carefully constructed assumptions about the homeless veteran who disrupted her meticulously planned morning. She pulled out her smartphone and quickly searched for information about Evelyn Thornton, her fingers moving rapidly across the screen while keeping one eye on the unfolding drama. The search results confirmed what James had claimed. Evelyn Thornton, renowned pianist and teacher, had indeed owned a Steinway Model D that was later donated to charity auctions. The timeline matched his story perfectly, but Rebecca found herself caught between factual verification and the cognitive dissonance of accepting that a homeless man possessed such intimate knowledge of classical music history. James continued his revelation, his voice taking on a quality that suggested he was speaking as much to himself as to his audience. "I haven't touched a piano in 8 years, he admitted, the words emerging with painful honesty. "After Afghanistan, after everything that happened over there." PTSD made it impossible to focus on anything that required precision, patience. Music became associated with pain rather than healing. He gestured toward the Steinway with something approaching reverence. "But this piano, standing here today, it's like hearing an old friend calling my name." Some connections run deeper than trauma, deeper than time. Charles Blackstone found himself in the uncomfortable position of having his assumptions challenged by demonstrable expertise, a situation he rarely encountered in his carefully curated world of wealth and influence. The homeless veteran's knowledge couldn't be dismissed as lucky guessing. The technical details were too precise, the historical information too specific. "Assuming for a moment that what you're saying is true," Blackstone said carefully, "what exactly are you proposing? A 30-second audition to prove your credentials?" His tone carried skepticism wrapped in cautious interest, the voice of someone recalibrating his position without fully committing to a new perspective. "Exactly that," James replied, his posture straightening with military precision. 30 seconds. If my fingers don't remember, if the music doesn't flow, I'll gather my things and leave without another word. But if they do remember..." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air between them. "Well, maybe there's something here worth exploring. Maybe the very people your foundation seeks to help have more to offer than anyone realizes." His proposal carried the elegant simplicity of a well-planned tactical maneuver, low risk for his opponents, high potential reward for his own position. The tension was broken by an unexpected voice, a clear, high sound that cut through the adult conversation with the directness that only children possess. "Daddy, why won't they let the piano teacher play?" The question came from Lily, an 8-year-old girl with blonde pigtails who'd been watching the proceedings with intense fascination. She stood beside her father, Robert Harrison, one of Blackstone Foundation's major donors, her small hand tugging at his expensive suit jacket. Her innocent question carried more impact than any of the sophisticated arguments that had preceded it, stripping away the complex layers of social maneuvering to reveal the simple human story underneath. James turned toward the child with a smile that transformed his weathered features, revealing glimpses of the man he'd been before war and circumstance had worn him down. "How did you know I taught piano?" he asked gently, crouching down to meet her at eye level. The question seemed to surprise him as much as it intrigued the watching adults. Lily tilted her head thoughtfully, considering her answer with the seriousness that children sometimes bring to important questions. "You have piano hands," she said simply, "and you hum. My teacher says people who really know music can't help but hum when they hear it in their heads." The child's observation created a moment of profound silence among the adults, each of whom found themselves reconsidering their own perceptions and assumptions. James had indeed been humming unconsciously, a fragment of Chopin's Minute Waltz that had been running through his mind since he'd first spotted the Steinway that morning. The melody was so deeply ingrained in his muscle memory that it emerged without conscious thought, a telltale sign of someone for whom music was not just knowledge, but identity. Robert Harrison, Lily's father and a successful businessman in his own right, stepped forward with the kind of measured consideration that had made him successful in both commerce and philanthropy. "Mr. Blackstone," he said, addressing the foundation head directly, "perhaps we should listen to what this gentleman has to say. Our foundation exists to serve veterans, and if this man truly has the expertise he claims—" He gestured toward the piano with evident curiosity. "Well, 30 seconds seems like a reasonable investment to verify his abilities. Maestro Giuseppe Alberti would arrive within the hour," Rebecca remembered suddenly, checking her smartphone for the updated schedule. The 72-year-old conductor emeritus of the New York Philharmonic was a regular attendee at Blackstone Foundation events, drawn by both the musical component and his personal commitment to developing veteran music programs. Giuseppe had been working with various organizations to create therapeutic music initiatives, but his efforts had been hampered by the challenge of finding qualified instructors who understood both musical excellence and military trauma. James caught the reference to the incoming maestro and felt a familiar mixture of anticipation and anxiety that he hadn't experienced in years. Giuseppe Alberti represented the pinnacle of classical music achievement, a figure from the world James had once inhabited but had long since left behind. The prospect of performing in front of such a distinguished musician added another layer of complexity to an already charged situation. His hands trembled slightly, whether from nerves, caffeine withdrawal, or the weight of memory, he couldn't say. "Maestro Giuseppe will be here soon," Rebecca announced, her voice carrying a note of warning that could be interpreted multiple ways. "He's been working with us on veteran music initiatives. If you truly have the background you claim, he'll certainly recognize your abilities." Her statement served both as a validation of James's potential credentials and as a challenge that raised the stakes considerably. Recognition by such a distinguished figure would transform the situation completely, while failure to impress would definitively end any possibility of further consideration. "How did you know I taught piano?" James asked again, his voice barely above a whisper as he looked down at Lily's earnest face, suddenly struck by the child's intuitive perception that had cut through all the adult skepticism and posturing to reach something true. The arrival of Maestro Giuseppe Alberti transformed the atmosphere in Lincoln Plaza from tense curiosity to something approaching reverence. The 72-year-old conductor emerged from a black sedan with the deliberate grace of someone who had spent decades commanding attention through presence alone. His silver hair caught the morning light as he surveyed the unexpected crowd gathered around the Steinway, his experienced eyes immediately assessing the situation with the quick intelligence that had made him one of the most respected figures in classical music. Giuseppe's scheduled visit was part of his ongoing collaboration with the Blackstone Foundation to develop music therapy programs for veterans, but the scene before him suggested complications that hadn't been part of the morning's agenda. Rebecca Walsh hurried forward to greet the maestro, her professional composure slightly strained by the morning's unexpected developments. "Maestro Alberti, welcome," she said, extending her hand in greeting while trying to position herself between him and the crowd surrounding James. "We've had a small situation develop this morning. Nothing that should interfere with your scheduled meeting with Mr. Blackstone." Her words carried the hopeful tone of someone trying to minimize a problem that had already grown beyond easy containment. She gestured vaguely toward the gathering crowd, hoping to guide Giuseppe's attention away from the homeless veteran, who had become the center of so much unwanted attention. But Giuseppe's trained eye had already fixed on James, and something in the homeless man's posture triggered a flicker of recognition that the maestro couldn't quite place. James stood with his back straight, hands clasped behind him, in a position that suggested both military discipline and musical training. A combination that was uncommon enough to be memorable. The way he held his head, the angle of his shoulders, even the careful positioning of his feet, spoke of someone who had spent significant time performing before audiences. Giuseppe had worked with thousands of musicians over his career, and certain physical habits became as distinctive as fingerprints to someone who knew what to look for. Charles Blackstone stepped forward, clearly hoping to control the narrative before it spiraled further beyond his management. "Maestro, this is a situation we're handling. A homeless individual who has been disrupting our event preparation with claims about musical expertise." He spoke with the dismissive tone of someone accustomed to having his judgments accepted without question, but something in Giuseppe's expression suggested the conductor was forming his own opinions about the situation. "We were just in the process of asking him to move along, so we can complete our setup without further interference." Giuseppe studied James more carefully, his conductor's eye noting details that had escaped the attention of the others present. The calluses on James's fingertips were positioned exactly where a serious pianist would develop them. Not the general roughness of manual labor, but the specific thickening that came from years of contact with piano keys. The unconscious way James swayed slightly to an internal rhythm suggested someone for whom music was not an intellectual exercise, but a physical language. Most tellingly, James's gaze kept returning to the piano, with the hungry intensity of someone who genuinely understood what he was looking at. "What is your name, sir?" Giuseppe asked, addressing James directly despite the obvious disapproval of the Foundation officials surrounding him. His voice carried the natural authority of someone accustomed to cutting through social conventions when they interfered with his pursuit of musical truth. The crowd fell silent, sensing that this moment might prove pivotal in determining how the morning's drama would resolve. Giuseppe took several steps closer to James, studying his face with the concentrated attention he typically reserved for evaluating potential soloists. James felt the weight of recognition building in Giuseppe's expression, though he couldn't tell whether the maestro remembered him specifically or simply recognized the type of person he had once been. "James Mitchell, sir," he replied, his voice carrying the respectful tone of someone addressing a figure of genuine authority. "I had the honor of performing under your direction once, many years ago, the Young Artists Competition at Lincoln Center, 2008. The memory emerged with surprising clarity, bringing with it a flood of associations from his former life, the weight of formal concert attire, the particular acoustics of that hall, the nervous energy that preceded performances before distinguished audiences. The recognition hit Giuseppe like a physical blow, his eyes widening as memory aligned with the evidence before him. James Mitchell? The disbelief in his voice was evident, but it was the disbelief of someone confronting an unexpected transformation rather than questioning the truth of what he was seeing. "My God, where have you been?" The maestro's tone shifted from professional courtesy to genuine concern, reflecting the personal investment he had made in promising young musicians throughout his career. He stepped closer, his hands reaching out as if to confirm that James was real rather than some figment of memory. The revelation created a moment of suspended animation among the gathered crowd, as everyone present recalibrated their understanding of what they were witnessing. Rebecca Walsh felt the ground shift beneath her assumptions once again, while Charles Blackstone found himself in the uncomfortable position of having dismissed someone who clearly possessed legitimate credentials. The murmur of the crowd grew more animated as people processed the implications of this unexpected recognition by one of classical music's most distinguished figures. "The war changed everything, Giuseppe," James said quietly, using the maestro's first name with the familiarity of someone who had earned that privilege through shared musical experiences. Afghanistan took pieces of me that I'm still trying to find. Music became complicated, associated with too many memories I couldn't process, when his words carried the weight of genuine trauma, offering insight into the psychological journey that had led from concert halls to cardboard signs. The vulnerability in his admission created an unexpected intimacy among strangers, transforming what had been a public spectacle into something approaching a private conversation. Giuseppe stepped closer, his conductor's intuition recognizing the authentic pain in James's voice, while simultaneously assessing the potential for musical recovery that might still exist within the damaged man before him. "This man," he announced, turning to address Charles Blackstone and the gathered crowd with unmistakable authority, "was one of America's most gifted pianists. He studied with Evelyn Thornton, won competitions, had a Juilliard scholarship that he declined to serve his country." His voice carried the conviction of someone stating objective fact rather than offering opinion. The public validation transformed the entire dynamic of the situation, creating a reversal that left everyone present struggling to adjust their expectations and assumptions. The homeless veteran they had been prepared to dismiss was suddenly revealed as someone whose credentials exceeded those of most professional musicians. Charles Blackstone found himself facing the uncomfortable reality that his foundation's mission of serving veterans had nearly led him to eject someone who embodied exactly the kind of talent and sacrifice his organization claimed to value. The crowd's energy shifted palpably, skepticism giving way to anticipation as they realized they might be witnessing something extraordinary. "James, would you like to try?" Giuseppe asked gently, his voice carrying both invitation and challenge. "Just us. No pressure. Let's see if your hands remember what your heart once knew." The maestro's words acknowledged both the potential for disappointment and the possibility of redemption, offering James a chance to reconnect with his former self without the burden of unrealistic expectations. The crowd held its collective breath, sensing that they were about to witness either a moment of triumph or a painful demonstration of how completely trauma could separate someone from their gifts. James felt his hands tremble as he looked toward the piano, suddenly aware that everything he had claimed about himself was about to be tested in the most public way possible. 8 years of silence stretched between him and the instrument that had once been his voice, his identity, his purpose. I don't know if I remember how," he admitted, his voice barely audible as doubt and hope warred within him. The walk from the edge of the crowd to the piano bench felt like crossing a battlefield under enemy fire. Every step weighted with the expectations of strangers and the ghost of his former self. James approached the Steinway with the careful reverence of someone entering a sacred space after years of exile, his weathered hands hovering inches above the keys without making contact. The bench height was perfect, adjusted by Tom Collins to the standard that professional pianists preferred, and James found himself automatically checking the pedal positions habits so deeply ingrained that 8 years of absence couldn't erase them. The familiar ritual of preparation began to calm his nerves, muscle memory awakening like an old friend who remembered him despite the changes time had wrought. The crowd had grown to nearly 100 people now, drawn by whispered accounts that traveled through the plaza faster than any social media post could spread. Office workers on coffee breaks, early arriving vendors, and curious passers-by formed a semicircle around the piano. Their conversations created a low hum of anticipation that reminded James of the moment before a curtain rose, when audiences held their collective breath in preparation for whatever magic or disaster might unfold. Giuseppe positioned himself where he could observe both James's technique and the crowd's reaction, his conductor's instincts analyzing the dynamics of a performance space he hadn't expected to encounter. James closed his eyes and tried to summon the opening measures of Chopin's Ballade number, 1 in G minor, Opus 23, the piece he'd performed at the Young Artists competition where Giuseppe had first heard him play. The melody existed somewhere in the deepest layers of his memory, buried beneath years of trauma and deliberate forgetting, but still intact like a photograph preserved in a forgotten drawer. His right hand formed the opening chord position, while his left found the bass notes, the muscle memory so precise that his fingers automatically curved to the exact angles his teachers had drilled into him decades earlier. The first touch of his fingertips against the keys sent an electric shock through his nervous system, a physical reminder of who he had once been. The opening measures emerged tentatively, his touch uncertain, as if he were testing whether the piano would remember him as clearly as he remembered it. The first phrase of the ballad faltered slightly, his timing imprecise and his dynamics uneven, drawing skeptical murmurs from portions of the crowd who'd expected either immediate mastery or complete failure. James felt the familiar tightness in his chest that had plagued him during the worst of his PTSD episodes, the sensation that the air around him was too thin to support proper breathing. But Giuseppe's steady presence anchored him, the maestro's silent encouragement serving as a lifeline to pull him through the initial uncertainty that threatened to overwhelm his confidence. Gradually, like a rusty machine finding its rhythm, James's playing began to smooth and strengthen. The technical passages that had once been second nature started to emerge with increasing confidence, his left hand finding the complex bass patterns, while his right navigated the intricate melodic lines that made Chopin's music so distinctive. The crowd's murmur shifted from skepticism to curiosity as they witnessed the transformation taking place before them, not the instant mastery of a movie scene, but the gradual awakening of dormant skill, made more powerful by its imperfection and humanity. Rebecca Walsh found herself leaning forward, her smartphone forgotten in her hand, as she watched a homeless veteran reveal layers of ability that challenged everything she thought she knew about talent and circumstance. The emotional heart of the ballad began to emerge as James's confidence grew, his interpretation carrying depths of experience that hadn't been present in his younger performances. The melancholy passages spoke of loss and longing with an authenticity that could only come from having lived through genuine sorrow, while the passionate sections burned with the intensity of someone who understood the preciousness of beauty in a world that could destroy it without warning. His pedaling technique, once mechanical and learned, now served the music with instinctive sensitivity, creating colors and textures that surprised even Giuseppe with their maturity and emotional intelligence. Charles Blackstone watched the performance with growing amazement and discomfort, his assumptions about homelessness and worth crumbling with each measure of music that filled the plaza. The businessman in him recognized a valuable asset when he saw one, but the human being in him struggled with the implications of how completely he'd misjudged someone based on appearance and circumstances. The Foundation's mission statement spoke eloquently about serving veterans, but he realized how hollow those words had become when faced with an actual veteran whose service had cost him everything society typically used to measure success. As James reached the climactic passages of the ballad, his technique bloomed into something approaching his former glory. The complex runs and arpeggios flowing with the natural ease that separated truly gifted musicians from merely competent ones. The crowd fell completely silent, even the skeptics among them recognizing that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Not just technical skill, but the resurrection of an artist who had been presumed lost. A few people held up their phones to record the performance, though most seemed too captivated to think about documentation, caught up in the immediacy of live music in an unexpected setting. The final measures of the piece emerged with haunting beauty, James's interpretation bringing new meaning to familiar phrases through the lens of his life experience. Where his younger self had played with technical brilliance and intellectual understanding, his current performance carried emotional weight that transformed the music into something deeply personal, yet universally accessible. Giuseppe found himself genuinely moved, not just by the resurrection of talent, but by the artistic growth that suffering had somehow made possible. The homeless veteran who'd been dismissed as a nuisance had revealed himself as a musician whose abilities had been deepened rather than destroyed by his trials. When the last note faded into silence, the plaza remained quiet for several heartbeats before erupting into applause that seemed to surprise even those who were clapping. The sound echoed off the surrounding buildings, drawing the attention of people in nearby offices who looked down from their windows to see what had caused such a commotion. James sat at the piano bench with his hands resting on his knees, overwhelmed by the flood of emotions that performing had released grief for what he'd lost, joy at what had survived, and something approaching hope for what might still be possible. Giuseppe approached the piano with tears in his eyes, his professional composure finally cracking under the weight of what he'd just witnessed. "James," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "that was extraordinary, not just technically, but artistically. You've grown as a musician in ways I wouldn't have thought possible." The maestro's validation carried the weight of someone whose opinion could launch careers, but more importantly, it offered recognition of James's humanity and worth at a moment when he needed it most. The crowd began to disperse slowly, many people stopping to place bills and coins in the cardboard box that had once held James's sign, their contributions totaling $1,247 by the time the last person had passed. Charles Blackstone approached the piano where James still sat, processing the magnitude of what had just occurred. The billionaire's expression had transformed from dismissive irritation to something approaching awe, his carefully constructed worldview having been thoroughly challenged by a 12-minute performance. "James," he said, his voice carrying a humility that surprised everyone who heard it, "I owe you an apology, and perhaps a conversation." The VIP tent behind the main stage felt like entering a different world, its climate-controlled interior a stark contrast to the October chill outside. Charles Blackstone led James through the entrance, followed by Giuseppe and Rebecca, their small procession drawing curious glances from the foundation staff, who were finalizing preparations for the afternoon's formal program. Inside, the space hummed with quiet efficiency board members, reviewing speaking notes, caterers arranging silver coffee services, and assistants coordinating last-minute logistics for an event that would determine the allocation of millions in charitable funding. James felt the familiar discomfort of being the only person in the room whose clothing came from thrift stores rather than department stores. But Giuseppe's supportive presence helped ground him in the reality that his worth wasn't determined by his wardrobe. "Please sit," Charles said, gesturing toward a leather chair arranged around a small conference table. His tone had undergone a complete transformation from their first encounter, now carrying the respectful courtesy he typically reserved for fellow philanthropists and business leaders. "I find myself in the unusual position of needing to apologize for judgments I made based on incomplete information." He poured coffee from an elegant silver service, offering James a cup with the same attention he would show any important guest. The beverage was excellent, far superior to the convenience store coffee that had become James's standard. But he tried not to let the contrast remind him too sharply of everything he'd lost. James accepted the coffee gratefully, the warmth of the cup helping to steady his hands, which still trembled slightly from the adrenaline of his performance. "Mr. Blackstone," he said carefully, "I appreciate the courtesy, but I'm not sure what possibilities you're referring to. I'm just a veteran who happens to know something about music." His caution was born from years of disappointment, from promises that had evaporated like morning mist when circumstances became inconvenient for those in power. "That's where you're wrong," Giuseppe interjected, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades evaluating musical talent. "You're a veteran who happens to be an extraordinarily gifted musician. There's a significant difference." He turned to address Charles directly, his conductor's passion evident in every word. "I've been working with your foundation for 2 years now, trying to develop music therapy programs for veterans who are struggling with reintegration. The challenge has always been finding instructors who understand both the musical requirements and the psychological complexities of military trauma." Rebecca Walsh, who had been quietly taking notes on her tablet, looked up with growing understanding. "You're suggesting that James could be part of the solution we've been seeking?" Her MBA training kicked in automatically, analyzing the potential synergies and implementation challenges. Someone who's experienced both the heights of musical achievement and the depths of post-service struggle would certainly bring unique credibility to such a program. Charles leaned forward, his businessman's instincts recognizing an opportunity that could transform both his foundation's effectiveness and James's circumstances. "My veteran music initiative has been stalled for 2 years because we couldn't find the right person to lead it. Someone who understood both sides of the equation. We have the funding, we have the institutional support, but we've been missing the human element that could make it work." He paused, studying James's reaction carefully. "I can offer $25,000 for a pilot program, 3 months working with Giuseppe to develop curriculum and test approaches with a small group of veterans." The offer hung in the air between them, like a bridge spanning an enormous chasm, representing possibilities that James had stopped allowing himself to imagine. $25,000 would solve his immediate housing crisis, provide stability for the first time in years, and offer a chance to rebuild some version of the life he'd lost. But it also carried risks, the possibility of failure, the challenge of working with other veterans whose trauma might mirror his own. "Why now?" James asked, his voice carrying a challenge that surprised everyone in the tent. "Because I'm useful to you, or because you finally see veterans as human beings with something to offer?" The question cut through the polite conversation like a blade, forcing Charles to confront the uncomfortable reality of his own motivations and assumptions. "I've been homeless for 3 years, Mr. Blackstone. Invisible to people like you. The only thing that's changed is that I proved I can play piano in a way that serves your purposes." The accusation landed with the impact Charles deserved, forcing him to examine his own privilege and the systemic blindness that had allowed him to drive past homeless veterans for years without seeing them as individuals worthy of consideration. "You're absolutely right," he admitted, his voice carrying a humility that his employees rarely heard. "I have been blind to the humanity of people whose circumstances I didn't understand. Your performance today didn't just demonstrate your musical ability. It forced me to confront my own prejudices about worth and potential." Giuseppe watched the exchange with the satisfaction of someone seeing important truths being acknowledged. "James," he said gently, "this isn't charity. This is an opportunity for you to use your gifts in service of others who need what you have to offer." The pilot program would start small. 12 veterans, group sessions twice a week, individual instruction as needed. You'd be helping people find their way back to themselves through music. The practical details began to take shape as Rebecca outlined the logistics. Partnership with the local VA hospital would provide access to veterans who were ready for this type of intervention. A small studio space could be rented and equipped with basic instruments. Giuseppe would provide musical oversight, while James handled the day-to-day instruction and emotional support that only someone with shared experience could offer. "I need to start slow," James said finally, his voice carrying the caution of someone who had learned not to trust too much too quickly. "Group sessions first, building trust before attempting anything more ambitious. And I want transparency, no public relations campaigns, until we prove this actually works. These veterans have been used as symbols and talking points too often. They deserve programs that actually help, rather than ones that just look good in annual reports." Charles nodded, recognizing the wisdom in James's approach and the validity of his concerns about exploitation. "Agreed completely. This pilot will be evaluated purely on outcomes, participant engagement, measurable improvements in psychological markers, retention rates. If it works, we'll expand it." He extended his hand across the table. "Do we have an agreement for a 3-month pilot program?" James looked at the offered handshake, knowing that accepting it would change everything. His living situation, his daily routine, his relationship with his own identity as both veteran and musician. "We have an agreement," James said, grasping Charles's hand firmly. "But there's one more thing I'd like to request. If this pilot succeeds, I'd like to eventually perform with the participants, not as their teacher, but as their colleague." Giuseppe smiled broadly, his conductor's imagination already envisioning the potential for such performances. "James, if you're willing and the participants are ready, I'd be honored to help arrange something modest to start, perhaps a small concert at a community center." "There's one more thing," Charles said, as they reached the tent's entrance. "If this pilot program shows the kind of results I suspect it will, Giuseppe has mentioned the possibility of a small performance venue, nothing as ambitious as Carnegie Hall, but perhaps something that could showcase what participants have accomplished." 6 weeks later, James Mitchell stood in the small music studio that had become his second home, watching 12 veterans arrange their chairs in the familiar circle that had become their ritual. The space wasn't glamorous, a converted warehouse room with basic acoustic treatment, donated upright pianos, and folding chairs that squeaked when people shifted their weight. But it had become something more valuable than any concert hall, a place where broken people could safely explore the possibility of healing. The pilot program had exceeded everyone's expectations, not in dramatic transformations or miraculous recoveries, but in the quiet, steady progress that real healing required. 8 of the 12 participants showed measurable improvements in sleep quality. 6 had begun performing in small group sessions, and most importantly, none had dropped out. James himself had found temporary housing in a studio apartment 3 blocks from the VA hospital, a modest space that felt palatial after years in his van. The regular income had stabilized more than just his living situation. It had given him a structure around which to rebuild his identity as something other than a victim of circumstance. Working with other veterans had forced him to confront his own trauma in ways that individual therapy never could, because helping others navigate their demons required him to face his own with newfound honesty. The piano in his apartment was a used upright that Giuseppe had helped him select, its tone imperfect, but its presence transformative in ways that had nothing to do with its monetary value. The morning's session began like all the others, with a simple check-in that had evolved into something approaching group therapy. Maria Santos, a former Army medic who'd lost her hearing in one ear from an IED blast, sat at the keyboard working through a simplified arrangement of amazing grace that she could feel through the vibrations in her fingertips. Next to her, Robert Kim, a former Marine sniper struggling with survivor's guilt, practiced scales with the mechanical precision of someone who needed structure to keep darker thoughts at bay. These weren't the dramatic breakthroughs that made for inspiring documentaries, but they represented something more valuable: the slow, unglamorous work of rebuilding lives, one note at a time. "Today I want to try something different," James announced, his voice carrying an authority that had grown naturally over the weeks of working with the group. "We've been focusing on individual pieces, but music is ultimately about connection, about shared experience. I'd like us to try playing together. Nothing complex, just a simple hymn or folk song that we all know." The suggestion created a moment of nervous energy in the room, because playing with others required a vulnerability that went beyond individual performance. It meant trusting that others would support you if you faltered, and committing to supporting them when they needed it. Giuseppe had been observing from the back of the room, his presence no longer intimidating, but comforting, like a grandfather watching his grandchildren at play. He'd attended every session for the past month, not as an evaluator, but as someone genuinely invested in the success of something he'd helped create. "What James is suggesting," Giuseppe said gently, "is that you move from being individual musicians to being an ensemble. It's a different kind of courage, but one that I think you're all ready for." His words carried the weight of someone who'd spent decades understanding the psychology of musical collaboration. The piece they chose was Shenandoah, a folk song simple enough that everyone could participate regardless of their skill level. James played the melody on piano, while Maria provided harmonic support on a second keyboard. Robert had discovered an unexpected aptitude for percussion, keeping time on a simple drum kit that helped ground everyone else's rhythm. Others hummed or played simple parts on donated guitars and a violin that one participant had owned since childhood, but hadn't touched since returning from deployment. The sound that emerged wasn't polished or professional, but it carried something more valuable: the genuine emotion of people who had found their voices again after years of silence. Charles Blackstone entered quietly during the final verse, his presence barely noticed by the participants who were lost in the simple joy of making music together. He'd made a point of visiting the program regularly, not for photo opportunities or public relations benefits, but because he'd discovered something unexpected in the process of creating it. Genuine fulfillment that went beyond the tax benefits and social recognition that typically motivated his charitable giving. Watching James work with other veterans had taught him lessons about leadership and authentic connection that all his business success had never provided. After the session ended and the participants had left, the four of them, James, Giuseppe, Rebecca, and Charles, gathered in the small office that served as the program's administrative center. The walls were covered with simple drawings and thank you notes from participants, a collection of testimonials that carried more weight than any formal evaluation could provide. Rebecca had compiled the official metrics that would determine the program's future: attendance rates, psychological assessments, feedback surveys. The numbers told a story of modest but consistent success that justified continued investment. "The pilot has exceeded our expectations in every measurable category," Rebecca reported, her tone carrying genuine satisfaction rather than professional obligation. "We've had inquiries from 3 other cities who are interested in replicating the program. The VA hospital wants to expand our partnership to include family counseling sessions. And most importantly, the participants themselves are asking about performance opportunities." She gestured toward a handwritten petition that several veterans had signed, requesting the chance to share their music with others who might benefit from hearing it. Giuseppe leaned forward, his conductor's excitement evident despite his attempt to maintain professional composure. "I've been in contact with the community center downtown. They have a small auditorium that seats about 200 people. Nothing grand, but intimate enough that our participants wouldn't feel overwhelmed." He paused, looking directly at James. The question is whether you feel they're ready, and whether you're ready to perform with them. Not as their teacher, but as their colleague. James felt the familiar flutter of performance anxiety mixed with anticipation, but this time it felt manageable rather than overwhelming. The prospect of playing for others no longer carried the weight of proving his worth or justifying his existence. Instead, it represented an opportunity to demonstrate the healing power of music and the resilience of the human spirit. "Let's ask them," he said simply. "This program is about their journey, not mine. If they want to share their music, then we'll help them do it in a way that honors both their courage and their growth." Charles stood up, his decision already made, despite the careful deliberation he typically brought to financial commitments. "I'm approving the full expansion, $150,000 annually, renewable based on continued success. We'll start with programs in 3 additional cities, each one led by someone who understands both music and military trauma." He extended his hand to James, but this time the gesture carried the respect of equals rather than the charity of patron to recipient. "The program needs a name, something that captures what you've built here." James considered the question, thinking about the 12 veterans who'd trusted him with their broken pieces and helped him reassemble his own. "Healing Notes," he said finally, "because that's what we're all doing, finding the notes that help us heal and learning to play them together." 6 months later, the phone call that would change everything came on a Tuesday morning while James was reviewing lesson plans for the expanded program. The voice on the other end belonged to Evelyn Thornton's daughter, calling from Boston with news that would complete a circle that had begun decades earlier. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, "I've been following your work with veterans. My mother always believed that her piano should serve a greater purpose than sitting in storage. We'd like to donate it permanently to your program." 1 year later, James Mitchell no longer carried a cardboard sign reading, "Can I play it for food?" He was program director of Healing Notes, the first veteran music therapy program to receive official VA recognition. The numbers were real. 47 veterans had completed the program across 4 cities. 23 found stable employment. 31 showed significant improvement in mental health metrics. Not thousands, but 47 lives transformed through the simple act of making music together. James performed monthly concerts now, not at Carnegie Hall, but at community centers and VA hospitals. Evelyn Thornton's piano sat in the main center, bearing a plaque. "Music heals what words cannot reach." Each week, dozens of amateur musicians gathered around it, including veterans who'd discovered that their voices hadn't been lost, just waiting for the right moment to sing again. The most important lesson: comeback isn't about returning to former glory, but finding new purpose from old pain. Every veteran James taught, every note they played together, proved that talent never truly disappears. It just needs the right moment to heal. Sometimes the question isn't, "Can I play it for food?" but "Can I play it for hope?"